Night hangs low over the Pacific. Late 1943. Somewhere between the scattered islands and the open sea, the sky is empty to the naked eye. No moon. No horizon. Only the steady drone of engines cutting through black air. Japanese bombers move confidently through the darkness. Their crews trust the night. For years, it has protected them. American fighters cannot see them. Searchlights are useless out here. Anti-aircraft fire fires blind. Darkness has become a shield, and Japanese pilots know it. Inside one of those aircraft, the cockpit lights are dim. Instruments glow faintly. Outside, nothing moves. The enemy is nowhere, and everywhere, miles away, another aircraft flies without lights. Its pilot stares forward, but his eyes are not searching the sky. Behind him, a small screen pulses softly. A thin green line sweeps in a circle. A blip appears. Then steadies, the distance closes in silence. No flares rise. No warning shots fire. The night does not change. But invisibility has ended. And from this moment forward, the sky will remember who learned to see in the dark. The Pacific War did not begin in darkness. It began in sudden daylight, in fire and smoke, when Japanese aircraft crossed the skies over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. That opening blow was swift, coordinated, and devastating. It reflected a deeper reality of the early war. Japan entered the conflict with an air arm that was confident, experienced, and prepared for aggressive operations across vast distances. Japanese naval aviation had been shaped by years of combat in China. Pilots were trained rigorously, often flying hundreds of hours before seeing frontline duty. They learned to navigate by instinct, by stars, by sea color, and by wind. The Imperial Japanese Navy prized visual skill above all else. Seeing the enemy first meant survival. Technology, especially electronics, was viewed as secondary to human ability. In the early 1940s, this belief seemed justified. Across the Pacific, the United States faced the war from a very different position. American pilots were well trained, but the U.S. military had not yet fought a modern, sustained air war. The distances involved in the Pacific were enormous. Bases were scattered. Radar technology existed, but it was young, bulky, and unreliable in combat conditions. Early radar sets were designed for ships or fixed ground stations, not aircraft hunting aircraft at night. During the first year of the war, night belonged almost entirely to Japan. Japanese bombers struck American positions after sunset with little opposition. Over Guadalcanal in 1942, Japanese aircraft used darkness to resupply and reinforce their forces. The missions became known to American troops as the Tokyo Express. Bombers flew low and fast, guided by experienced crews who trusted their eyes and instincts more than instruments. American fighters, lacking night interception training and equipment, were largely helpless once the sun went down. This confidence hardened into doctrine. Japanese air commanders believed night operations neutralized American industrial advantages. The United States could build more aircraft, train more pilots, and replace losses more quickly, but only in daylight, where visual detection and massed formations mattered. At night, numbers meant less. Skill mattered more. Darkness leveled the field. Radar, in Japanese thinking, did not change this equation. Early intelligence reports suggested American radar was imprecise, prone to failure, and easily confused by weather or terrain. Some Japanese pilots dismissed it entirely. Electronics could break. Eyes could not. Night flying had always relied on judgment, experience, and nerve. Meanwhile, American losses told a different story. Bases were bombed after dark with increasing accuracy. Shipping routes were harassed. Crews learned to expect attacks at night because there was little chance of interception. The sky above Pacific Islands became a one-sided battlefield once the sun disappeared, yet within this imbalance, pressure quietly built. American commanders understood that the war could not be won if half the clock belonged to the enemy. Industry could replace aircraft, but it could not replace vulnerability. The solution would not come from better eyesight or braver pilots alone. It would require learning to fight in a realm where human senses failed, and that realization began to shift the war's direction long before Japanese pilots noticed anything had changed. By mid-1942, the United States had already begun searching for a way into the night. The solution did not come from a single invention or a single moment, but from an accumulation of quiet decisions made far from the front lines. Laboratories replaced airfields. Engineers replaced aces. And inside windowless rooms, the war was translated into signals and echoes. Radar was not new. British scientists had used ground-based radar during the Battle of Britain to detect incoming Luftwaffe raids. By 1941, the Royal Air Force had begun experimenting with airborne interception radar, set small enough to fit inside aircraft, capable of detecting another plane in darkness or cloud. The systems were crude by modern standards. Screens were small. Resolution was limited. Operators had to interpret shapes, not pictures. But they worked. American officers observed these developments closely. In 1942, as U.S. forces struggled against Japanese night attacks, British experience became a blueprint. The challenge was scale. The Pacific demanded longer ranges, harsher environments, and aircraft capable of carrying heavy equipment over vast distances. The first American airborne radar sets, such as the SCR-520 and SCR-527, were adapted from British designs. They were bulky, temperamental, and required a trained operator to sit behind the pilot, reading a glowing cathode ray tube while the aircraft vibrated through darkness. Early trials were discouraging. False returns appeared. Rain cluttered screens. Pilots struggled to trust instructions that contradicted what their eyes told them. But progress came quickly. The United States possessed an industrial capacity unmatched by any other nation in the war. Once radar was accepted as a necessity rather than an experiment, production accelerated. Training programs were created specifically for radar operators. Interception procedures were standardized. Ground controllers learned to vector fighters toward targets detected far beyond visual range. At the same time, aircraft design adapted to the new mission. Single-seat fighters were ill-suited to night interception. The task demanded teamwork, a pilot to fly, an operator to see what could not be seen, and an aircraft stable enough to carry heavy electronics. This led to the development of dedicated night fighters. The most significant of these was the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. Designed from the start around radar, it carried a 3-man crew and an onboard interception set powerful enough to guide it directly onto enemy aircraft in complete darkness. It was fast, heavily armed, and capable of long patrols over ocean or jungle. When it entered service in late 1943, it represented something entirely new in Pacific air combat. Radar also reshaped doctrine. Night interception was no longer reactive. Instead of waiting for bombs to fall, American fighters could patrol proactively, guided by ground radar and then by their own onboard sets. Darkness ceased to be empty space and became a mapped environment, defined by bearings, distances, and closing speeds. Japanese intelligence noted these developments but underestimated their impact. Radar was still viewed as a supplement, not a replacement for vision. Many Japanese pilots believed American crews would never master the coordination required to fight effectively at night. Technology might help locate an aircraft, but closing in for a kill, they believed, still required sight. What Japanese aircrews did not see was how quickly American crews were learning to trust machines more than instincts. Instructors emphasized procedure over intuition. Radar operators trained for hours on simulated screens. Pilots practiced flying blind, following calm voices rather than their own eyes. By late 1943, radar had moved from theory to routine. It was no longer an experiment hidden behind the lines. It was airborne, operational, and waiting. And soon, it would be tested against pilots who believed the night still belonged to them. Inside an American night fighter, the war felt smaller. The sky outside was an empty void, offering no reference points, no confirmation of movement or danger. For pilots, this absence was unsettling. Decades of aviation had trained them to fly by sight. Now they were asked to trust instruments that glowed faintly in the dark, guided by voices instead of vision. Behind the pilot, the radar operator worked in near isolation. His world existed inside a circular screen, where lines and blips replaced clouds and stars. Training taught him to read movement in static, to sense intention in drifting echoes. Every call had to be precise. A single misread return could send the aircraft miles off course, or directly into the enemy. Communication became survival. Short, controlled instructions guided turns, climbs, and descents. The pilot rarely saw the target until the final seconds, if at all. There was no room for doubt or ego. Trust replaced instinct. Discipline replaced improvisation. For these crews, night fighting was not dramatic. It was methodical. The tension came not from explosions, but from waiting, minutes stretching long as radar returns slowly converged. When contact was made, there was often no warning, no maneuvering duel. A brief flash of gunfire, then darkness again. This form of combat demanded emotional restraint. There were no crowds, no visible victories. Success was measured in confirmations on paper, not cheers. It was warfare reduced to procedure and patience, and that discipline would soon be tested against an enemy who believed skill alone could defeat machines. Japanese pilots entered the war with a deep confidence in their abilities. Many were veterans of long campaigns over China, accustomed to flying extended missions with minimal navigational aids. Night flying was not an obstacle, it was a refinement. Darkness rewarded experience and punished hesitation. Japanese doctrine emphasized visual detection and aggressive maneuvering. Pilots were trained to spot silhouettes against starlight, reflections on water, or the faint exhaust glow of enemy engines. Radar, in this worldview, was unnecessary. Electronics could fail. The human eye, trained and disciplined, was reliable. Early encounters reinforced this belief. American aircraft rarely challenged Japanese night operations. Bombing runs over Allied positions met little resistance. Crews returned safely, often without ever seeing an enemy fighter. Confidence hardened into dismissal. Radar was spoken of as an American crutch, useful perhaps for defense, but not decisive. This attitude shaped behavior. Japanese bombers flew predictable routes, confident that darkness provided concealment. Escorts were limited. Evasive tactics were minimal. There was no sense of being hunted. What they did not realize was that their greatest advantage, night, was being quietly measured, mapped, and prepared for interception. Airborne radar did not offer vision. It offered information. Early American sets displayed distance and direction, nothing more. Operators translated these abstract signals into commands: turn left, level off, reduce speed. The technology was imperfect. Sea clutter interfered. Weather distorted returns. Skill mattered, yet radar possessed one decisive advantage. It did not care about darkness. It functioned regardless of moonlight, cloud cover, or visual deception. Where human eyesight searched blindly, radar simply measured. As procedures improved, the technology became less about detection and more about control. Intercepts followed predictable geometry. Closing speeds were calculated. Escape routes narrowed. By the time a Japanese crew sensed danger, the engagement had already been decided. Radar did not replace pilots. It removed uncertainty, and in doing so, it began to turn confidence into exposure. Night interception was not improvisation. It was geometry. American crews learned to treat the sky as a grid rather than an open void. Ground radar stations detected incoming aircraft at long range, plotting speed, altitude, and heading. Fighters were vectored into position long before contact was possible. Once airborne radar acquired the target, the engagement narrowed. The radar operator guided the pilot into a controlled approach, usually from below and behind, where enemy crews were least likely to detect movement. Speed was adjusted carefully. Too fast, and the fighter would overshoot. Too slow, and the target would slip away. Japanese bombers, accustomed to flying unchallenged at night, rarely maneuvered defensively. Their formations were loose. Navigation lights were sometimes dimmed but not eliminated. Exhaust flames remained visible. Radar-guided fighters exploited these habits. The approach was silent. The attack brief. There was no turning battle. No pursuit across the sky. The objective was interception, not engagement. Fire was opened only when the target filled the gunsight at close range. Seconds later, the fighter disengaged, climbing back into darkness. Tactically, this reduced risk. It conserved fuel. It maximized surprise. Over time, interception patterns became routine. What had once required improvisation became procedure. American commanders faced skepticism when advocating radar-based night fighting. Many pilots distrusted instruments. Some saw radar operators as secondary crew rather than equals. Early failures reinforced doubts. Leadership addressed this through structure. Training emphasized crew integration. Commanders assigned experienced pilots to night units and protected them from being siphoned into daylight missions. Losses were analyzed meticulously. Procedures were revised, not abandoned. On the Japanese side, leadership responded more slowly. Reports of aircraft lost at night were often attributed to accidents or ground fire. The idea that American fighters could consistently intercept in darkness conflicted with established beliefs. Radar countermeasures were discussed, but production limitations and competing priorities delayed implementation. This divergence in leadership response mattered. One side adapted doctrine around technology. The other questioned whether adaptation was necessary at all. Night had once offered certainty. For Japanese crews, it meant safety. For Americans, it meant vulnerability. Radar reversed these associations. As interceptions increased, Japanese aircrews began to feel watched. Missions that once passed without incident now ended with unexplained losses. There was no warning. No visual confirmation of an enemy. Aircraft simply failed to return. For American crews, the psychological shift ran in the opposite direction. Darkness no longer meant helplessness. It meant opportunity. Confidence grew quietly, reinforced by procedure rather than bravado. The moral balance of the night changed. The hunter and the hunted exchanged places, not through force of personality, but through mastery of information, and as these patterns solidified, the war approached a moment when disbelief could no longer survive contact with reality. The change did not announce itself with a single battle. It emerged over a series of nights, scattered across the Pacific, where Japanese aircraft began to vanish without explanation. By early 1944, these incidents were no longer isolated. They formed a pattern. One of the earliest signs appeared during Japanese night bombing and reconnaissance missions against American-held islands in the Central Pacific. Aircraft that departed on routine flights failed to return. Crews reported being fired upon without seeing an enemy. Wreckage, when found, showed concentrated damage, short bursts, close-range strikes. This was not anti-aircraft fire. It was interception. American night fighter squadrons were now operational. Equipped with radar-guided aircraft, they patrolled approaches to key bases and shipping lanes. Ground radar detected incoming raids well before they reached their targets. Fighters were launched in darkness, guided by controllers who had practiced the same sequences repeatedly. Once airborne, the process unfolded with mechanical precision. The radar operator acquired the target. Distance closed steadily. The pilot adjusted course and speed according to calm instructions spoken over the intercom. There was no rush. The enemy could not see them. Japanese pilots, flying by habit and experience, noticed nothing unusual until the final moments. There were no searchlights. No tracer fire climbing toward them. Only sudden impacts. Engines flamed. Control was lost. Aircraft disappeared into the sea or jungle without radio calls. Reports from Japanese units began to change in tone. Confidence gave way to confusion. Crews spoke of being attacked from nowhere. Some believed they were encountering new anti-aircraft weapons. Others suspected mechanical failure or mid-air collisions. Few immediately accepted the idea of consistent night interception. Meanwhile, American records told a clearer story. Interception logs showed increasing success rates. Radar operators refined their technique. Pilots learned when to disengage and when to pursue. Losses remained low. Efficiency increased. One night over the Pacific followed another, and the outcome repeated itself. Japanese aircraft that once moved freely now flew through monitored space. The sky had been divided into sectors, watched continuously, even when invisible. By the time Japanese command began to recognize the scale of the problem, the balance had already shifted. Night operations no longer guaranteed safety. Darkness no longer concealed movement, and with each interception, disbelief narrowed into realization. Recognition arrived too late to stop the momentum. By mid-1944, American night interception had matured into a system rather than an experiment. Radar coverage expanded across island chains as new bases came online. Night fighter units operated continuously, rotating crews and aircraft to maintain pressure. What had once been defensive became assertive. Japanese night missions began encountering resistance almost immediately after crossing detection range. Bombers were intercepted before reaching their targets. Reconnaissance aircraft vanished without reporting enemy contact. Losses accumulated in places where none had been expected. Aircraft like the P-61 Black Widow demonstrated their purpose. Heavy, stable, and guided by onboard radar, they could locate and pursue targets independently once airborne. Even older fighters adapted with radar assistance from the ground. The concept proved scalable. Night was no longer a special condition. It was simply another operating environment. Japanese responses were fragmented. Some units attempted evasive tactics, changing altitudes or routes. Others reduced night operations altogether. Efforts to introduce radar into Japanese aircraft came too slowly and in too few numbers. Industrial limitations, fuel shortages, and mounting daylight losses constrained adaptation. The psychological effect deepened. Crews no longer trusted the dark. Missions were flown with heightened tension. The absence of visual warning made interception feel inevitable rather than avoidable. Confidence eroded. American air superiority extended beyond daylight hours. Bases previously vulnerable after sunset became defended spaces. Shipping routes gained protection through the night. The operational clock expanded from 12 hours to 20-4. By the end of 1944, the outcome was no longer in question. Radar-guided night fighters had closed one of the last gaps in American control of the Pacific sky, and as the war moved toward its final phase, the consequences of that change began to ripple outward. The immediate effects were measurable. Japanese night bombing accuracy declined sharply. Missions were aborted. Aircraft turned back early or failed to locate their targets. Loss rates increased in proportion to time spent over defended areas. What had once been a reliable method of harassment became a gamble with diminishing returns. American bases reported fewer nighttime disruptions. Repair crews worked without interruption. Airfields operated around the clock. This continuity mattered. Aircraft could be launched earlier. Maintenance cycles shortened. The tempo of operations increased steadily, feeding daylight offensives that followed. Japanese commanders faced a narrowing set of options. Daylight operations were already costly due to American numerical and technological superiority. Night had been the alternative. Now it was compromised. Attempts to shift tactics, flying lower, dispersing formations, altering routes, offered limited protection against radar-guided interception. The strategic balance tilted further. Control of the air no longer paused at sunset. It extended across the full cycle of day and night. This allowed American forces to plan operations without regard for time, compressing Japanese response windows and accelerating the pace of advance across the Pacific. For aircrews, the war became more exhausting. Japanese pilots flew with the knowledge that escape was uncertain regardless of light conditions. American crews carried the strain of constant patrols, but with growing confidence in their systems and procedures, losses were recorded quietly in operational summaries. Each interception added another line to reports that showed a clear trend. Night no longer offered sanctuary, and as these immediate effects accumulated, their longer-term implications began to shape the final year of the war. Beyond the immediate losses, radar-driven night fighting reshaped the structure of air warfare itself. By late 1944, the United States no longer treated night as a special condition requiring improvisation. It was fully integrated into operational planning. Radar coverage expanded alongside every new airfield. Night fighter patrols were scheduled as routinely as daylight escorts. This shift had lasting consequences for Japan's ability to contest the air. Fuel shortages and pilot attrition limited training hours. Introducing new technology under these conditions proved nearly impossible. Experimental radar sets existed, but crews lacked time to master them, and production could not meet demand. The gap widened. American doctrine, by contrast, codified what had been learned. Night interception procedures were standardized. Radar operators became recognized specialists. Aircraft design continued to incorporate electronics as core systems rather than additions. The lessons learned over the Pacific influenced planning far beyond the immediate conflict. Psychologically, the loss of darkness was profound. For Japanese airmen, the war felt increasingly constricted. There was no longer a time when vigilance could relax. For Americans, confidence grew not from heroism, but from reliability, systems that worked regardless of visibility. As the war drew toward its conclusion, radar-guided night fighting stood as one of the quiet revolutions of the conflict. It did not produce dramatic turning points visible on maps. Instead, it removed uncertainty. It shortened the war by denying the enemy time. And when the guns finally fell silent, the skies would never return to what they had been before radar learned to see in the dark. War often turns on moments that are loud and visible: explosions, breakthroughs, flags raised over captured ground. But some of its most decisive changes happen quietly, in places where no one is watching. The conquest of the night was one of those changes. For centuries, darkness had been a natural boundary in warfare. It slowed movement, concealed intentions, and punished those who ventured into it unprepared. In the early Pacific War, Japanese pilots believed they understood this truth better than their enemy. Experience, discipline, and eyesight had served them well. For a time, it was enough. Radar altered that balance without drama. It did not replace courage or skill. It reframed them. Pilots learned to trust information they could not see. Crews learned to operate as systems rather than individuals. Victory came not from daring maneuvers, but from patience, coordination, and accuracy. The result was irreversible. Once darkness could be measured, it could no longer protect. Night ceased to be a refuge and became another domain of control. Airspace was no longer defined by light, but by awareness. This transformation extended far beyond the Pacific. Modern air warfare would be built on the same principle, that information matters more than visibility. Sensors would grow smaller, faster, more precise. But the lesson would remain the same. The pilots who once laughed at radar did so because they trusted what had always worked. They could not see what was coming, and by the time they realized the night was watching them, it was already too late.